The world woke up to a shock wave that ripped through global politics. Satellites detected unexpected movements across Venezuela's northern coast. Military convoys rolling out, missile batteries being repositioned, naval units mobilizing in tight formation. Within hours, intelligence channels confirmed the unthinkable. Venezuela had deployed advanced Russian-made anti-ship missile systems directly toward U.S. naval vessels operating in the Caribbean. What began as routine maritime activity now shifted into the most serious standoff the region has faced in decades. The atmosphere thickened as Washington assessed the sudden escalation. U.S. warships accustomed to unhindered dominance in the Western Hemisphere found themselves in the crosshairs of weapons designed specifically to neutralize them. These missiles were not symbolic. They were precision-engineered, battlefield-tested systems capable of piercing modern naval defenses. And now they were active, fueled, and locked in position across major intelligence hubs. Analysts scrambled to determine Russia's exact role. This was no quiet arms sale. The speed, coordination, and timing of the deployment signaled a deeper strategic alignment. Moscow was no longer observing from afar. It was placing itself directly in the path of American influence, using Venezuela as both an ally and a launchpad. The Caribbean, long seen as a stable zone under the U.S. security umbrella, had transformed overnight into a contested battlefield of global power. Inside Caracas, officials projected confidence and defiance. They declared the movement a necessary response to what they called an unlawful display of U.S. military intimidation. Their message was unmistakable. Venezuela would not stand down, and with Russia at its side, it believed it no longer needed to. Crowds gathered in the streets, some fearful, others electrified by the surge of national pride. The government framed the standoff as a fight for sovereignty, the opposition as odd as a dangerous gamble. But behind every public statement lay deeper motives. Venezuela's leadership, emboldened by Russia's unwavering support, was challenging the roots of U.S. dominance in Latin America. And Russia, in turn, was seizing an opportunity the U.S. had underestimated. For years, Washington assumed its naval presence alone would deter any challenger in the Caribbean. Yet now, its warships were facing a rival's weapon systems positioned only a few hundred miles from its own shores. The Pentagon issued a formal warning, but stopped short of immediate retaliation. This wasn't a crisis that could be handled with routine posturing. Every analyst understood the truth. One misreading, one misfire, one misunderstood radar signal could trigger a chain reaction impossible to contain. The world's most powerful militaries now stood within seconds of a direct confrontation. And all of it, every maneuver, every signal, every headline was being watched closely by nations across the world, each calculating how this showdown would reshape global balance. As military assets continued to reposition across the Caribbean, a wave of urgency spread through diplomatic channels. Radios crackled, encrypted lines buzzed, and emergency briefings were called in Washington, Moscow, and Caracas. The stakes had risen far beyond regional politics. What began as a localized response had escalated into a global signal, one that challenged the balance of power in a way unseen since the Cold War. U.S. intelligence confirmed that Russian advisors were actively present on Venezuelan soil, assisting with the calibration and deployment of their advanced anti-ship missile systems. These were not routine instructors. They included specialists in electronic warfare, radar jamming, and coastal defense coordination experts, typically reserved for high-priority strategic operations. That revelation sent shockwaves through the Pentagon. It meant the U.S. warships off the Venezuelan coast were not simply facing Venezuelan forces. They were facing Russia's most capable technicians operating in real time. Tension aboard U.S. vessels grew as new threat assessments arrived hourly. Captains issued quiet but urgent directives. Crew rotations tightened. Missile defense systems remained primed. Every radar sweep, every unidentified signal, every shift in the electromagnetic spectrum was now treated as a potential trigger. The ocean felt unnaturally still, as if waiting for an outcome none of the sailors wanted, but all were prepared for. Inside Venezuela, the government sought to project unwavering resolve. Broadcasts played footage of troops marching, missile launchers rolling along coastal highways, and commanders saluting the nation with fierce determination. But beneath the patriotic display, internal anxiety was undeniable. Military leaders understood the magnitude of what they had stepped into. A confrontation with the United States, even with Russian support, would unleash consequences far beyond their control. Yet retreating now would be seen as weakness, both domestically and internationally. Russia, meanwhile, used the crisis to its advantage. State media framed the U.S. naval presence as an act of provocation, a deliberate encroachment on the sovereignty of an allied nation. Russian officials issued statements portraying themselves as protectors of balance against Western aggression. But behind closed doors, their strategy was more calculated. Create pressure where the U.S. least expects it, stretch American influence thin, and challenge Washington in its own hemisphere. As global markets reacted, oil prices fluctuated violently. Traders feared that even a minor clash in the Caribbean could disrupt major shipping routes. The geopolitical shockwaves were immediate. Latin American nations scrambled to reassess their alliances. NATO members called emergency consultations, and world leaders urged restraint with growing desperation. Yet the reality on the ground remained unchanged. Two of the most powerful nations on earth were now locked into a dangerous military stare-down, with Venezuela as the ignition point. And as the sun set over the Caribbean waters, the distance between diplomacy and disaster narrowed with every passing hour. Nightfall brought no calm. The darkness only sharpened the tension as surveillance drones circled silently above the Caribbean, scanning every ripple in the water, every heat signature on the horizon. Warships maintained combat readiness, their silhouettes barely visible, but their presence unmistakable. A floating reminder that peace in the region was hanging by a thread. Deep inside command centers, screens glowed with red markers tracking potential threats. Officers monitored them with disciplined stillness, aware that a single misinterpretation could thrust the world into catastrophe. In Caracas, the situation grew more complicated. Intelligence reports warned of heightened espionage activity, foreign surveillance, and cyber probes targeting critical infrastructure. Government officials braced for possible digital sabotage that could destabilize communications or paralyze power grids. Venezuela's leaders believed they were staring down not just military pressure, but an invisible battlefield, one where information, warfare, economic leverage, and psychological operations carried as much weight as missiles on a launcher. For Washington, patience was wearing thin. U.S. naval commanders demanded greater operational freedom, arguing that hesitation would embolden adversaries and allow Russia to entrench itself deeper into the hemisphere. But civilian leadership urged restraint, fully aware that one rash strike could ignite a domino effect spiraling far beyond regional control. Internal debates intensified as advisors weighed the risk of appearing weak against the catastrophic consequences of escalation. Meanwhile, Russia amplified its support. Satellite intelligence, encrypted communication networks, and strategic advisors flowed into Venezuela with quiet efficiency. Moscow's message was clear. It would not allow its ally to be isolated or intimidated. Analysts around the world recognized the pattern. This was classic hybrid power projection designed not to start a war, but to make any U.S. military action unbearably costly. And it was working. Every new Russian deployment tightened the strategic pressure, turning the Caribbean into a contested arena of global power rivalry. Venezuelan citizens caught in the crossfire of geopolitics watched events unfold with a mixture of fear and defiance. Some saw the crisis as a stand for sovereignty, a chance to resist what they believed was decades of foreign interference. Others feared their country was being used as a pawn in a conflict far larger than themselves. Markets trembled, prices surged, and uncertainty seeped into every corner of daily life. Yet in the midst of unease, national pride intensified. fueled by speeches, broadcasts, and the belief that their nation was part of something historically significant. Internationally, pressure mounted. The United Nations called for emergency sessions, though diplomats privately admitted that neither Washington nor Moscow was likely to bend. Global powers watched with strategic calculation, evaluating how this unfolding drama might shift alliances, reshape security doctrines, or expose hidden vulnerabilities. What alarmed them was not simply the risk of conflict. It was the speed at which normal diplomatic norms had collapsed. As midnight approached, radar operators detected anomalies, brief electronic spikes, signal distortions, unidentified echoes across the sea. No one knew if they were natural interference, stealth operations, or probing attempts. But their presence served as a chilling reminder. The situation was moving into an unpredictable phase. Every second carried weight. Every decision could tilt the balance. The world was bracing for a dawn that might redefine the century. The Atlantic and Europe watched uneasily as Washington intensified its posture. NATO analysts began drafting scenarios from limited naval skirmishes to broader regional instability. Their concern was not only the Venezuelan theater itself, but the expanding Russia-China-Iran alignment that seemed increasingly willing to test U.S. resolve. Yet even within NATO, whispers circulated. Was America escalating too quickly? Were they being pulled into a confrontation shaped by Moscow's long-term strategy? These doubts filtered quietly through diplomatic channels, but none dared to challenge the U.S. publicly. Not yet. Meanwhile, in Caracas, Maduro's government broadcast triumphant images of the newly reinforced coastal defenses. Russian military advisors appeared alongside Venezuelan officers, inspecting radar systems, rehearsing anti-ship strike protocols, and analyzing potential American approach vectors. For Maduro, this was more than defense. It was a chance to shift the domestic narrative. Facing internal economic hardship and political fractures, he framed the U.S. naval presence as proof of imperial aggression, and the Russian missiles as symbols of Venezuela's sovereignty and resilience. In Moscow, Putin's inner circle saw the unfolding tension as a strategic gift. Each move confirmed their narrative that Washington was overextended, predictable, and vulnerable to geopolitical pressure outside Europe. The Kremlin instructed its media to amplify every Venezuelan broadcast, showcasing the swift deployment of Russian weaponry as a sign of Moscow's global reach. What many in the West didn't see was the real objective, forcing the U.S. to divide its focus at a time when Russia needed breathing room for its own regional ambitions. At the Pentagon, debates grew more intense. Some argued the carrier group's presence should be expanded, adding a second destroyer to signal overwhelming dominance. Others warned that doing so would play directly into Russia's hand, increasing the risk of miscalculation while giving Moscow justification to escalate elsewhere. The National Security Council convened late into the night as intelligence revealed new satellite images, mobile Russian launches repositioning deeper into Venezuelan territory, shielded by jungle terrain and civilian infrastructure. The question was no longer whether Venezuela could strike, it was whether they would, and how the U.S. should respond if they did. As tensions surged, regional powers stepped cautiously into the discussion. Colombia urged de-escalation, fearing that any exchange would spill across borders and destabilize its fragile security environment. Brazil took a more neutral but wary stance, advising all parties to avoid catastrophic consequences. Yet Washington knew that if a missile ever left Venezuelan soil, Russian-made or not, the world would consider it a direct challenge to U.S. supremacy in the Western Hemisphere. By the time dawn broke over the Caribbean, the situation had crystallized into a single unspoken truth. The next decision, by Washington, by Moscow, or by Caracas, could redefine global power for the next decade. The Caribbean was no longer a quiet strategic backwater. It was now a fault line, and every move from this moment forward would determine whether it remained stable or cracked under the weight of escalating global rivalry. As global tension tightened like a steel cable, Washington accelerated intelligence operations across the Caribbean basin. Surveillance drones circled high above Venezuelan airspace, gathering every possible detail. Thermal signatures of mobile launchers, convoy movements, radar emissions, and encrypted communications bouncing between Caracas and Moscow. What disturbed analysts was not the weaponry itself, but the precision in Venezuelan deployments. It was clear Russian advisors weren't just assisting. They were orchestrating the entire defensive architecture, embedding a level of discipline rarely seen in Venezuelan forces. Inside the Situation Room, the mood shifted from concern to controlled alarm. Reports indicated that several Russian anti-ship missile batteries had been maneuvered into ambush corridors along the Venezuelan coast, concealed behind thick terrain and capable of firing without warning. The Pentagon's Pacific and European commanders now observed closely, knowing that any misstep could cascade into a global crisis. It wasn't lost on them that while the U.S. focused on the Caribbean, adversaries elsewhere were watching for moments of distraction. In Moscow, Kremlin strategists evaluated Washington's every move with clinical precision. They understood America's dilemma: withdraw the carrier group and appear weak, or dig in and risk becoming trapped in a scenario engineered by Russia. Putin had long believed that the U.S. relied heavily on reputation. Credibility mattered as much as firepower. By placing Washington in a position where hesitation could damage its standing, Russia forced the Americans to either escalate or concede. Neither option was ideal, and both strengthened Moscow's narrative of a shifting world order. Caracas sensed the tightening of this strategic triangle. Venezuelan state media broadcast patriotic anthems showcasing soldiers preparing coastal batteries, naval crews rehearsing defensive maneuvers, and missile operators standing ready. Maduro proclaimed that Venezuela would not bow to intimidation, insisting that his country stood firm against foreign occupation. Yet behind closed doors, his inner circle worried. They understood the stark truth. A single misfire, a single radar lock, a single miscalculated launch could trigger an American retaliation. Venezuela was not equipped to withstand. As the world watched, oil markets jolted violently. Energy analysts feared the slightest disruption in Caribbean shipping lanes could send prices soaring overnight. Shipping companies rerouted vessels, insurers doubled their premiums, and financial markets braced for broader instability. Even nations with no direct stake in the conflict now felt its tremors, realizing how deeply global trade depended on predictable American dominance and how quickly that predictability could unravel. Meanwhile, diplomatic backchannels lit up with frantic messages. European states urged restraint. China called for peaceful resolution, carefully avoiding criticism of Russia while subtly discouraging further escalation. Smaller nations across Latin America pushed for emergency regional talks, knowing the outcome would shake the hemisphere's balance of power. Yet, amid all the appeals for calm, the leaders driving this confrontation understood something uncomfortable. Once momentum builds, it becomes difficult to stop. Each nation's next move risked becoming the spark that tipped the world into a crisis no one could fully control. The Caribbean standoff was no longer just a regional tension. It was a global test of power. U.S. global overstretch and shifting alliances, patience, and political nerve. And the world waited, breath held for the moment when diplomacy or disaster would finally reveal which path the great powers would choose. Night fell over the Caribbean like a dark veil, but the tension did not fade with the sun. If anything, the darkness intensified it. U.S. satellites detected the faint heat signatures of Venezuelan missile units repositioning again, moving deeper into hardened coastal positions. Their patterns were deliberate, almost taunting, each shift signaling readiness, each regrouping suggesting preparations for a rapid strike if provoked. The Pentagon's analysts noted the precision. These were not the chaotic movements of an untrained force. This was choreography, and Moscow was the choreographer. Aboard the U.S. carrier, the atmosphere remained disciplined yet heavy. Pilots slept in short cycles, fully suited, ready to scramble at a moment's notice. Strike groups stood by with engines warmed, navigation systems live. Weapons armed but locked under strict rules of engagement. Every officer understood the delicate balance. One premature maneuver could be interpreted as aggression, but one delayed reaction could risk American lives. The carrier's captain replayed satellite feeds over and over, searching for patterns, deviations, anything that hinted at imminent threat. In Washington, the White House convened another emergency briefing. Intelligence had intercepted a coded transmission between Russian advisors in Venezuela and Black Sea Fleet Command, an unusual cross-communication that raised alarms across multiple agencies. Why would Moscow link operations so far apart unless they were preparing for synchronized messaging or simultaneous pressure points? Some feared Russia might be preparing distractions in other regions to exploit America's focus on the Caribbean. Others believed it was psychological warfare, reminding Washington that any escalation here would not remain isolated. Across the ocean, Putin met with his senior defense officials in a secure bunker beneath the Kremlin. He reviewed charts showing U.S. naval positions, missile ranges, reaction times, and possible outcomes. To him, this confrontation was not about Venezuela itself, but about the credibility of American influence near Russian allies. If the U.S. backed down, Moscow could replicate this strategy elsewhere. If the U.S. escalated, Russia could use the confrontation to justify new military expansions and security demands. Either way, Russia saw opportunity, but the margin for miscalculation was razor thin. Inside Caracas, Maduro's circle navigated a storm of paranoia and determination. Advisors warned him that if war broke out, Venezuela would face catastrophic losses. But Maduro believed survival required boldness. Backing down would signal weakness at home and invite political chaos. Russian advisors urged him to maintain firmness, assuring him that Washington feared a drawn-out conflict. Yet if they understood the limits, Russia could help position weapons and shape strategy. It would not fight America directly on Venezuelan soil. That burden would fall entirely on Caracas. Meanwhile, the world's media turned the unfolding standoff into a global spectacle. News outlets ran real-time graphics showing naval formations inching dangerously close. Social platforms exploded with leaked images, satellite analyses, exaggerated rumors, and doomsday predictions. Every civilian speculation, every viral clip added another layer of uncertainty to a crisis already stretched to breaking. And still, amid all the noise, the most dangerous element remained the same: silence. No shots fired, no missiles launched, no sudden deviations, just two powers facing each other across the Caribbean waters. Each watching, waiting, calculating. Every hour that passed increased the stakes. Every moment of restraint sharpened the tension. The world sensed a simple truth emerging. If anything broke this silence, it would not be a small incident. It would be a spark powerful enough to change the global order in a single instant. Dawn approached slowly, painting the Caribbean in muted shades of gray. But the calm horizon masked a storm of strategic anxieties. The U.S. Navy destroyers adjusted formation just before sunrise, shifting into a tighter defensive posture. Their radar swept the coastline in rhythmic pulses, detecting every flutter of movement: birds rising from trees, fishing vessels drifting near shore, and the faint electromagnetic signatures of Venezuelan targeting systems warming up. To seasoned commanders, these subtle signals meant only one thing: someone on the other side was testing reaction times, measuring responses, probing the boundaries of American patience. Inside the Pentagon, live feeds from reconnaissance drones flickered across massive digital screens. Analysts tracked the movement of a particular Venezuelan launcher convoy that had disappeared into dense terrain the previous night. Its sudden reappearance, now positioned along a concealed ridgeline, rattled junior officers. It was clear this unit wasn't simply repositioning. It was moving into a strike-oriented posture, angled directly toward the U.S. carrier's projected route. The Joint Chiefs debated whether this was an intentional escalation or a calculated bluff designed to manipulate Washington's next move. In Caracas, Russian advisors huddled with Venezuelan commanders in an underground operations center surrounded by maps, telemetry data, and secure communication consoles. Their discussions were precise and cold, focusing not on politics, but geometry, angles of approach, interception, probabilities, radar cross-sections of American vessels. They emphasized caution, but encouraged readiness, framing the standoff as a test of will rather than a prelude to conflict. Yet among Venezuelan officers, nerves frayed. Some feared the Americans would perceive their movements as hostile and strike preemptively. Their dilemma was brutal: show weakness and lose deterrence, or appear too bold and invite destruction. Meanwhile, Washington faced its own political firestorm. Senators held urgent closed-door briefings demanding answers about how close the country was to a clash with a Russia-backed military force so close to home. The administration reassured them that diplomacy was still the priority, but privately officials admitted the margin for de-escalation was shrinking by the hour. Every option carried risk. A retreat would embolden adversaries. An attack would ignite global outrage. A prolonged standoff would drain resources and stretch American focus thin at a time of already rising tensions worldwide. Global markets trembled as news outlets reported that the U.S. carrier group had shifted position overnight, though the exact coordinates were unknown. Energy traders scrambled, fearing the possibility of a blockade or accidental clash that could disrupt shipping lanes. Even tech markets reacted, anticipating cyber-related escalations between major powers if the crisis spiraled further. Investors recognized a pattern. Geopolitical tension rarely stays confined. It spills, it spreads. It infects every layer of global stability. Latin American governments grew increasingly alarmed. Colombia quietly reinforced its border. Brazil convened emergency security meetings. Mexico issued cautious statements urging de-escalation. Aware that any conflict in the Caribbean could reshape political dynamics across the entire hemisphere, smaller island nations caught between two superpowers debated whether to open their ports to U.S. logistics or remain neutral and risk diplomatic backlash. And yet, through all the pressure, through all the maneuvers, through all the intelligence warnings, one reality became inescapable. The standoff had entered a phase where a single miscalculation, a radar misread, a misunderstood transmission, a nervous soldier reacting too quickly could push both sides into irreversible action. The world felt suspended in a fragile balance, waiting for a gesture of restraint or a moment of chaos.